Welcome to Thalira Tales, where stories bloom in silence, carrying emotion, mystery, and hidden truth. Step in and let the tale unfold.
At 2:14 a.m., writhing in pain, I said, "I'm in labor." My husband kept his eyes closed. "Call a ride. Don't bother me." Outside, my mother-in-law sipped her wine. "Don't make a mess." My sister-in-law said coldly, "If there's no car, go yourself." I forced myself to drive to the hospital, not knowing that the brake system had been tampered with. They wanted me dead that night. But 7 days later, when they showed up at my door demanding to see the baby, I looked at them coldly and asked one question: "What baby?" If you found your way here, I'm glad you stayed. Leave a comment. Where are you watching from? Country, city, wherever you are in the world. Let me know you're there. This story includes fictional elements woven in for narrative and educational purposes. Any resemblance to specific names or settings is coincidental, but the lessons inside are ones worth keeping. The fog had already started lifting off Long Island Sound by 9 that Thursday morning, pulling back from the shoreline the way it always did, in April. Slow, unhurried, indifferent to whatever was unfolding beneath it. On Greens Farms Road in Westport, Connecticut, the oak trees stood wet and still, their upper branches just beginning to show the first pale trace of green. The houses set back behind their stone walls and iron gates looked exactly as they always did, composed private, built to give nothing away. I had believed for 4 years that a house with the right address could keep certain things out. I was standing in the doorway of our home at 9:11 in the morning, back straight, shoulder blades pressed against the wooden frame. My son James was asleep against my chest, bundled into a pale yellow wrap I had ordered online during a sleepless night 3 weeks before he arrived. He was 7 days old. His breathing was slow and even. His weight against my ribs was the most solid, uncomplicated thing I had felt in longer than I could clearly remember. I heard footsteps on the stone path before I saw anyone. Preston came around the side of the house first. He was wearing the charcoal blazer he reserved for investor meetings, pressed deliberate. The kind of put together that requires actual effort on a weekday morning. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he stopped. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when they walk into a room expecting it to be empty and discover it is not. 3 people followed him. First was Constance, Preston's mother, 62 years old, silver-haired, and carrying herself with the particular certainty of a woman who had never once in her life questioned whether her presence was welcome. I had spent 4 years watching her hold a wine glass as though she were doing it a favor. Right now, she was holding her leather handbag with both hands' knuckles pale against the strap. I had not seen her grip anything that tightly across 4 years of Sunday dinners and holiday tables. Beside her stood Gerald, Preston's father. Where Constance occupied every room she entered, Gerald preferred the margins, the quieter man who said little, and somehow still directed outcomes. He had spent 4 decades making decisions that other people believed were their own ideas. His right hand was pressed into a loose fist against his thigh. It was a small detail, the kind most people would never notice. I noticed. Behind both of them stood Vanessa Hartwell. I had never met Vanessa in person, but I had spent the better part of the past week studying her professional profile. She was a senior partner at Meridian Capital Group, a Manhattan-based venture capital firm. The kind of organization that moves quietly inside wealthy circles and commits tens of millions of dollars to companies it believes will return multiples on that investment. Vanessa was the person Meridian sent when the stakes were high enough to require someone who did not flinch. She was dressed exactly as she appeared in her firm's online directory, sharp, composed, nothing careless anywhere on her. But she was not looking at Preston the way a senior investor looks at a partner after a catastrophic financial failure. She was not looking at Constance or Gerald or the house behind me. She was looking at me. What I saw in her expression was not grief, and it was not fury. It was calculation, the careful, patient look of someone who has come to negotiate and still believes she holds a card worth playing. Whatever had brought Vanessa Hartwell to a private residence in Westport on a Thursday morning, it was not loyalty to Preston. It was something she needed, and she believed I had it. Preston took a step toward the door. "Where's the baby?" he asked. Just that. No greeting, no apology, no explanation for why he was standing on the front path of our home alongside his mother, his father. And a woman I knew had received a phone call from him at 2:23 in the morning at the exact moment I was driving myself alone to the hospital. I looked down at my son, at the soft curve of his cheek resting against my collarbone, at the way his fingers had curled into small, complete fists even in sleep. As if somewhere beneath all that newness he already understood that the world required a person to hold on. Then I looked back up at Preston. "What baby, Preston?" The four of them went still. Preston's face moved through several expressions without finishing any of them. Constance's grip on the handbag tightened further. Gerald's jaw set in a way I recognized from every dinner conversation he had ever quietly controlled. And Vanessa's eyes did not change at all. She simply held my gaze with the focused patience of someone who has not yet found her opening, but has not stopped looking for it. That was when I understood something I had not fully seen before I opened the door. They had not come here together because they were united. They had come for separate reasons. And at least one of them had come specifically because she needed something only I could give her. "Let me take you back," I said, "to where this actually started. 7 days. That was the entire distance between the woman standing in this doorway and the woman who had stood in another one without light, without help, and without the slightest understanding yet of how large the thing already in motion around her truly was." James shifted slightly against my chest and settled again without waking. He slept through all of it, through the silence, through Vanessa's calculating eyes, through the particular weight of the morning air on Green's Farms Road. He had only been in the world for 7 days. He did not yet know what this world could ask of a person. 7 days ago, I was standing in a different doorway, darker, quieter, and just safe enough to fall apart in. The hallway outside our bedroom had no nightlight. I had meant to install one 2 months earlier. When my center of gravity shifted and the 3 a.m. bathroom trips became a nightly negotiation with darkness, I kept telling myself there was time. There was always going to be time. At 1:47 in the morning on April 11th, the first contraction arrived before my mind had any say in the matter. Sharp, low, and precise, the kind of pain that begins somewhere deep in your body and expands until it owns the entire lower half of you. I had read enough to recognize it. Nothing I had read had prepared me for how completely it took over. I was barefoot on the oak hardwood floor, one hand braced flat against the plaster wall. Breathing through my mouth the way the prenatal instructor had demonstrated 3 months earlier in a community center off Post Road. Short breath in, longer breath out. She had told a room full of nervous women not to fight it, to let the wave crest and pass. The wave crested. I waited. It passed. I pushed off the wall and walked to the bedroom. Our room was at the end of the hall, the primary suite, as the real estate listing had described it, which was a careful way of saying the room where 2 people who had once been glad to share a bed had spent several months maintaining opposite sides of a mattress large enough to make the distance feel almost polite. Preston was on his side, facing away, the blanket pulled to his shoulder. His breathing was slow and practiced. I said his name. He didn't move. I said it louder, and he shifted, not the startled movement of someone woken by emergency, but the deliberate, burdened shift of someone hoping a voice will stop if he waits it out long enough. "Preston." I put my hand on his shoulder. "Wake up." My water broke. He rolled onto his back and opened his eyes. Not fully, just enough to take me in. The wet hem of my nightgown. Whatever expression was on my face. I watched something move across his features in the dark, and for one moment I thought I saw him actually processing the weight of what I had said. Then his face settled into something I had seen before. Not alarm, not concern, irritation. "Call an Uber," he said. His voice was flat, still thick with sleep. "I have a board meeting at 8. I stood there and looked at him. The board meeting was real. Preston served on the executive board of his family's technology holding company, the same company that was preparing a major investor pitch built almost entirely on the algorithm I had spent 14 months writing. I understood the meeting mattered. I was also 39 weeks pregnant, standing 18 inches from him, with fluid soaking through the cotton of my nightgown, and a second contraction already beginning its slow climb up from the base of my spine. "Preston," I kept my voice level. "I cannot drive. I need you to take me." He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that something foolish and persistent in me began to hope. Then he reached over to the nightstand, picked up his wireless earbuds from their charging case and pressed them into his ears. Left one first, then right. The whole thing took about 8 seconds. I have spent more time than I care to admit thinking about those 8 seconds. Not because of what they communicated in the moment. I understood exactly what they communicated. What I have turned over in my mind is what they revealed in hindsight. A person caught genuinely off guard does not reach for their AirPods. That is not a reflex. That is a decision made in advance. in a calm and private moment about how a particular night was going to go. Somewhere underneath the performance of being asleep, Preston had been awake enough to decide that whatever I needed tonight was not going to be his responsibility. "Please keep it down," he said, and turned back toward his side of the bed. I stood in the doorway and looked at my husband, wireless earbuds in blanket resettled, the measured rise and fall of his shoulders already returning to something like sleep. And I thought about a conversation we had had 14 months earlier, before the pregnancy, before the IVF. There had been a quiet, careful discussion, the kind that happens when two people are trying to build something together, and one of them starts to understand that something may not be working the way it should. I had asked Preston to see a specialist. He had eventually agreed the way he agreed to things he found inconvenient through enough patient repetition that he could frame the decision as mutual. The doctor he chose was one Gerald had recommended. An office in Stamford, a composed man with neat handwriting and a set of results that Preston reported as coming back entirely normal. I had asked to see the paperwork. He said he had left it at the office. I asked again a week later. He said he would find it. He never found it. There had been an accident in 2019, a motorcycle, a winter road outside Hartford that Preston had described as minor and fully recovered from. He had not mentioned it again. I had not thought to ask. I did not know yet, standing in that hallway, everything those test results actually contained, or what the Dr. Gerald had recommended had been paid to say, or what the specific convenience of a wife who believed her husband was fertile had been worth to the people managing the situation from behind the scenes. That knowledge would come later, piece by careful piece. What I knew in that moment was smaller and more immediate. The man in that bed had made his decision, and waiting for him to reverse it was time I did not have. I pulled the bedroom door shut behind me. Not hard. Not with any performance of feeling. Just the quiet click of a door closed the way you close something you are finished with for the night. I stood in the hallway for 3 full breaths. Then I walked to the kitchen. Because somebody had to figure out how to get me to the hospital, and I had just understood that somebody was going to have to be me. The kitchen light buzzed on and threw its pale blue-white wash across the granite countertops, and I stopped in the doorway when I saw them. Constance was seated at the kitchen island with a glass of wine she had apparently helped herself to from the cabinet where we kept the good bottles. Tatum was at the far end of the counter, laptop open, earpiece in one ear, her eyes on her screen in the particular focused way that communicated. She was aware you had entered the room and had decided not to acknowledge it. They had been here since 8. A strategy dinner, Preston had called it, final preparations for the Meridian Capital pitch. I had made myself available for 2 hours, and then gone upstairs when the conversation had moved, as it always did, to territory that apparently did not require my presence. I had not expected them to still be here at 2 in the morning. I had also not expected to be standing in the kitchen doorway in a wet nightgown at 2 in the morning, but the night had already produced several things I had not expected. The first contraction since the hallway arrived without warning, low and sharp, the kind that pulls the breath out before you can prepare for it. My hand went to the counter edge. I leaned into it. Constance looked up from her wine glass. "For goodness sake," she said in the tone she reserved for household inconveniences. "Get yourself off the floor before you do it on the hardwood. Do you have any idea what water damage does to white oak?" I was not on the floor. I was leaning against the counter. I did not correct her. "My water broke," I said. "I need someone to take me to the hospital." Tatum did not look up from the laptop. "I'm on a call with the Meridian team in 20 minutes, she said. "Use the app." "I've tried the app. 3 drivers have canceled. Try again." She turned a page on the notepad beside her. "Preston said you had a bag ready. This was the plan." I looked at Tatum for a moment, at the careful, composed profile of a woman who had just told a 39-week pregnant person that canceling Uber drivers was a logistical problem to be solved independently. Then I looked at Constance, who had turned back to her wine. "Constance," I said, "please." "Nora." She set the glass down with the precise click of someone making a point. "You have been preparing for this for 9 months. You are not the first woman to go into labor. Preston has an obligation tomorrow morning that affects this entire family's financial future. Tatum has work that cannot be moved. And I did not drive 40 minutes from Fairfield to spend the evening managing a situation that was always going to resolve itself one way or another." She picked up her phone. "I'll call you a car service. Give me a moment." She did not call a car service. She opened her email. I pushed off the counter and walked to the far end of the kitchen where I had left my phone charging beside the coffee maker. Another contraction started its slow climb, and I pressed my palm flat against the cold granite and breathed and counted and waited. I called Elliot. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He was working. He always worked late with his phone face down, which I knew, and which I had been counting on not being true tonight. I hung up and called Preston. His phone rang once. The hard, immediate silence of a declined call. Then voicemail. He had turned it off. He had been awake 40 seconds ago. I had heard his movement in the bedroom when I left the hallway. He had turned off his phone. I opened the messaging app. I typed slowly, stopping twice for contractions. Preston, I'm in so much pain, not just from labor. I read it back. 10 words. True and too late, and addressed to a man who had turned his phone off. I deleted it without sending. Behind me, Constance said something to Tatum in the low, efficient register they used when they did not want to be heard clearly. I caught the word timing and the word inconvenient, and then a silence that was not in any meaningful sense a concerned one. I looked up from my phone. Through the kitchen doorway I could see the light I kept on in James's room, the warm glow I had installed myself at 7 months pregnant. One hand on the drill and one on the stud finder. The walls in there were painted Silver Lake. A soft blue-gray I had chosen alone and applied in 2 careful coats. While Preston was at a meeting, he said he could not move. The crib had arrived in 12 pieces and taken me 4 evenings to assemble. The mobile above it, white stars on a pale field I had hung on a Sunday. He had never asked to see inside that room, not once. I thought about October. Gerald at my kitchen table with his leather folder pointing to highlighted lines and calling them standard. Moving through the pages with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what was on every one of them. I had signed where he pointed because I had been 6 months pregnant and exhausted, and I had believed in the specific way you believe things when you have not yet been given a specific reason not to, that the people around me were not my enemies. I had not read page 11. I had not read page 19. Constance set her wine glass in the sink. The car service needs 25 minutes. She said, which I did not believe because she had not made a call. You'll be fine. First labors take hours. Tatum closed her laptop. We should get on the road, she said to her mother. Not to me. I need to be home before the Tokyo call. I watched them gather their things. Tatum's jacket. Constance's handbag held as always with both hands, the knuckles white against the strap. They moved through the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of people who had concluded their business and were ready for the next thing. At the doorway, Constance paused. Text Preston when you're admitted, she said. He'll want to know how it goes. Then she walked out. Tatum followed without looking back. The front door opened and closed, and the house went quiet in a way it had not been for hours, a specific, weighted quiet that had nothing to do with peace. I stood in the kitchen alone at 1:58 in the morning between contractions that were coming every 3 minutes. I put my phone in my pocket. I walked to my closet, my side, not Preston's, and I got dressed between contractions. Charcoal maternity pants, a gray pullover that had been Preston's once, flat shoes with no laces. I came back to the kitchen, took the phone charger from the outlet beside the coffee maker, and walked to the coat closet by the front door. I grabbed the hospital bag from the shelf, the one I had packed alone, the one Preston had never once asked to look inside, and I walked into the garage. The garage door took 11 seconds to open. I counted them. It was the kind of counting I had started somewhere in the hallway, not deliberate, not goal-directed, just the mind finding something to hold on to when words had run out. 11 seconds. I backed the SUV out slowly, and the tires made a quiet sound crossing the seam at the edge of the driveway before I turned onto Greens Farms Road. April in Westport at 2:14 in the morning was a different place entirely from the neighborhood I moved through during daylight. The houses had gone dark and interior showing nothing. The street lamps set at regular intervals threw pale amber light that illuminated the ground directly beneath them and left everything between in shadow. I could see the tops of the oak trees against a sky that held scattered clouds, and between them stars of the kind that only reveal themselves this late, when the suburb has finally quieted down enough to stop drowning them out. I turned south onto Post Road. US 1 at this hour was a different road than the one I drove to pick up groceries or drop off dry cleaning. Broader, emptier. The overhead lamps ran the length of it in both directions, turning the asphalt a pale industrial silver. I merged into the right lane, both hands on the wheel, and held a speed my body could manage. Not fast, not slow enough to be careless. Just forward. 2:14, I said out loud. Breathe. My own voice in the car sounded too present and too alone. I said it again anyway, because the alternative was silence. And silence was not something I could afford to sit in at this particular moment on this particular road. A contraction arrived at 2:16, building from the base of my spine, the way they all had a slow, deliberate climb that I had learned over the past 30 minutes. To meet with a specific kind of patience, I moved my right hand off the wheel and pressed it low against my abdomen. The car drifted slightly. I corrected with my left and counted steady and even in my head until the wave crested and began pulling back. 2:19, I said when it passed. Hand steady. I crossed the intersection at Campo Beach Road and kept going. To my left, a 24-hour gas station sent its red and white light out into the dark, like something searching for company. Ahead, a traffic signal cycled through green to yellow to red, and I was the only car at the intersection. I sat there and looked at both directions of the cross street, empty, absolutely still, the signal doing its patient work for an audience of one at 2:21 in the morning. Something broke loose in my chest and I laughed. Not the kind of laughter that comes from something being funny. The kind that escapes when the gap between what is happening and what was supposed to happen becomes too wide to hold quietly anymore, short without warmth, and entirely mine. 4 years ago on a Saturday evening in March, Preston had proposed at a restaurant on the Post Road waterfront, a place with white tablecloths and a view of the Sound that looked like something from a film about people who had figured out how to be happy. He had held my hand across the table and said, "I'll always be there." 3 words. I had believed them with the kind of conviction that belongs to a person who has not yet learned the difference between someone meaning something and someone saying it in the right way at the right moment to produce the right response. I had been 30 years old and holding a ring and looking across the table at a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The light turned green. I drove. The road curved gently past Campo Road, a long arc, where my hands followed the wheel without having to think too much about it. At 2:22 taking that curve, I pressed the brake to manage the bend and the car's response lagged for a fraction of a second, not absent, not alarming. Just a brief hesitation between the pressure of my foot and the deceleration I expected. Half a heartbeat's delay. I glanced at my right leg. My calf muscle had been clenched for the past 20 minutes, bracing through contractions, and my whole lower body was doing its best to keep up with several things at once. I flexed my ankle and pressed the brake again on a clear stretch of road. The car stopped exactly as it should. I attributed the moment to the state of my nervous system and moved on, because I did not have the capacity to investigate anything that was not actively threatening me, and because the road ahead was straight and the hospital was 9 minutes away. I would think about it later. Later was something I was still planning to reach. 2:25, I said. You can do this. A contraction arrived harder than the ones before it, the sharp climbing kind that takes the breath before you have a chance to prepare. I drew a long, slow inhale through my nose, pressed my palm flat against my lower abdomen, fixed my eyes on the center line, and counted to 5 in the back of my mind. The wave peaked. I exhaled. It pulled back. 2:29. I said to the empty road. Almost there. The Norwalk Hospital campus appeared at 2:38, the entrance sign lit from below the long drive curving toward the emergency department. I pulled into the drop-off lane at an angle that suggested I had stopped caring about geometry some time ago. I did not straighten the car. I cut the engine, reached to the back seat for the hospital bag, pushed open the door, and stood up into the cool April air. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency entrance were lit the way hospitals are at every hour, relentless, indifferent to the time of day, functioning for whoever arrived, without asking why or how they had gotten there alone. Through the glass I could see the reception desk and the corridor beyond it, blue, white, and purposeful. A young man in a dark security uniform came through the doors the moment he caught sight of me approaching. He was moving quickly, efficiently, one hand already on a wheelchair. His face set in the careful professional composure of someone trained to appear calm, regardless of what they were actually seeing. He stopped the chair in front of me, and then he spoke. Not harshly, not with clinical distance. What he said was the most honest thing anyone had put into words and directed at me in 4 full years. "Are you alone?" The security officer, his badge read, "Officer Dale." His voice was careful without being unkind, had said those 3 words the moment he stopped the wheelchair in front of me, and they landed somewhere much deeper than a routine intake question had any business landing. Not harshly, he had not meant them to cut. But certain questions have a way of finding the truest thing beneath whatever composure a person is holding together. and that one found mine without any effort at all. I looked at the floor for a moment. The entrance linoleum was institutional gray, with a faint blue undertone scuffed in the predictable places that hospital floors always are. Then I looked back up at Officer Dale, early 20s. The practiced calm of someone trained to manage situations that have already gone sideways, and gave him the only answer that was available to me. Yes, I said. Nothing else. No brief explanation of how I had arrived at a hospital entrance at 2:38 in the morning without another adult who thought to be here. No context. No apology. No performance of a woman who had not quite grasped the shape of her own situation. Just the word and the nod that followed, and the quiet of Officer Dale maneuvering the chair so I could sit down. He pushed me through the sliding doors without asking anything further. That was in the moment the second most generous thing anyone had done for me that night. The first had been the red light on Post Road that had given me something to look toward on an otherwise empty road. The emergency intake desk was staffed by a woman who had clearly been working since well before midnight and expected to be working long after I left. She pulled up my file, asked the standard questions, and set a clipboard in front of me. I signed the forms between contractions, the pen slipping on the third one, dropping off the edge of the clipboard and clicking against the floor, and I leaned down and picked it up before anyone else had a chance to move. A small thing, but the night had already taken more than enough from me, and I was not in the business of giving away what I did not have to. A nurse came around from the corridor beyond the desk, took one look at me with the focused assessment of someone whose entire career is built on reading people quickly and accurately, and introduced herself as Patricia. Nurse Patricia was somewhere in her mid-50s, steady and compact, with the kind of face that has absorbed enough difficult situations to stop being rattled by them without ever becoming indifferent to them. She had worked labor and delivery at Norwalk Hospital for 22 years. She told me not as small talk, but the way a person states a credential that is meant to carry weight. She checked my admission paperwork, noted what was missing, completed what she could, and did not once ask about my husband. She did not need to. Officer Dale's first question had already told her everything the forms had not. She walked me to the delivery room herself. What followed was the longest 2 hours and 14 minutes of my life, measured in 4-minute intervals, and the texture of a white ceiling I stared at until I had memorized every seam and scuff mark on it. The contractions had moved past the building, preliminary variety of early labor, into something far more deliberate, each wave arriving with the flat authority of something that cannot be reasoned with or delayed. I breathed the way I had been taught. I counted when counting helped. I traced a scuff mark on the ceiling tile 2 feet left of the overhead light, and lost count of how many times I came back to it. Nurse Patricia stayed past the end of her shift. I know this because another nurse mentioned it in the corridor around 3 in the casual way of someone noting an unremarkable fact, and because Patricia did not leave. She checked the monitoring equipment, refilled the water cup I had not asked her to refill, and said very little that was not necessary. At some point in the deepest part of the night, during a contraction that took every available resource and then came looking for more, she placed her hand over mine on the bed rail. She didn't say anything. She just held on. I thought in the brief space between the peak of that contraction and its withdrawal about the number of people in my life who had made large and audible promises about showing up when it mattered. I thought about how different presence looks in practice, how quiet it is, how it does not announce itself, how it simply remains. James arrived at 4:52 in the morning. He did not cry right away. The room had been full of effort and direction in the final minutes, voices measured and purposeful. And then, with the abrupt completeness of a story reaching its last word, it went still. I heard Patricia say something low and clear. I felt the weight of him before I saw him clearly. Warm, compact, real in a way that nothing had felt entirely real in a very long time. They placed him on my chest. He opened his eyes briefly, unsteadily, the way of someone who has just arrived somewhere completely new and is trying to understand where they are. His gaze had not yet learned to focus, but it moved, and it settled, and for a few seconds it was pointed in my direction. His mouth worked slightly. He smelled like nothing I had a word for. I looked at him, and the room contracted. The hospital, the drive, the kitchen, the bedroom. The 4 years of decisions I had trusted, and should not have all of it pulled back to a very great distance. He was here. Whatever Preston had planned to take, or had already taken, or intended to take, he had not taken this. Nurse Patricia dimmed the overhead light without being asked. She tucked a warm blanket around us both. She did not leave. By 6 in the morning, James had been examined and declared healthy by a pediatric resident, who shook my hand with genuine enthusiasm. A second nurse took over the monitoring rounds. Patricia reappeared 40 minutes later with a cup of coffee she set on my table without comment or expectation of thanks. My phone lay face up on the bedside table where I had placed it before 4. Preston didn't call. He didn't text. The screen had not lit once through the labor, through the delivery, through the first quiet hour of my son's life. It lay there in the pale gray light coming through the window, silent, unmoving, and more honest about the state of my marriage than anything Preston had said out loud in longer than I cared to measure. James opened his eyes at 6:11 a.m., not the way he had in the first minutes after his birth, that brief, unsteady look of someone newly arrived and not yet certain what to make of where they had landed. This was different, more deliberate. His gaze moved and then it found mine, and it stayed there with the unhurried certainty that only the very new and the very old seem capable of. As if looking directly at another face is simply what eyes are meant for and requires no practice whatsoever. 11 seconds. I counted them, the same counting I had started in the hallway at 1:47 and which had never entirely stopped. 11 seconds of a room that had been quietly active since before 5 in the morning going completely, entirely still. Nurse Patricia, who had moved to the chair beside the window sometime around 5:30, did not speak. She looked at James, and then she looked at me, and she allowed those 11 seconds to carry the full weight of what they were, without reducing them to commentary. James's eyes were brown, not the pale hazel of Preston's which shifted toward gray in morning light, not the flat, appraising dark of Gerald's, which always seemed to be evaluating something just past whatever was directly in front of him. James's eyes were warm and uncomplicated, and I recognized them immediately, because I had been looking at that same shade of brown in my own mirror for 33 years. He looked like me, only me. I had told myself during the pregnancy not to spend too much time hoping about what he would look like, that it was the kind of anticipation that sets a person up for disappointment, that babies look like whoever they look like, that the resemblance doesn't ultimately matter. What I had not let myself say out loud, even privately, was what it would have meant if he had looked like Preston. If every morning for the rest of his childhood I had looked at my son's face and seen a reflection of the man who had listened to me go into labor and reached for his earbuds. I looked at James's brown eyes at 6:11 in the morning and understood something I had not fully stated to myself before. The only thing inside that house that had been entirely mine, not co-signed, not held in a trust document, I had not had the energy to read carefully. Not shared by default or by law or by the particular logic of 4 years of marriage was this, and I had managed to carry it out with me. The room came back to its ordinary functions when James made a small exploring sound a few minutes later, and I adjusted the way I was holding him. Patricia stood from her chair, checked the monitoring equipment, noted something on the tablet she carried, and on her way back past the window she glanced at my phone where it lay on the bedside table. She said nothing. But she looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already understood, a brief, complete assessment of a dark screen, and the total absence of notifications. She drew no conclusion out loud. She offered no sympathetic expression. She simply noted it and moved on, and that restraint was more respectful than any words she might have chosen. The morning continued its regular rotations. A resident arrived at 7:30 to examine James, and confirmed everything was proceeding as it should. Breakfast came on a tray at 8. Which I managed with one hand. The hospital filled gradually with the sounds of the day shift replacing the night voices in the corridor, the soft percussion of carts, the particular rhythm of a large building returning to its daytime self. At 9:47 the screen of my phone lit up. A single message, from Preston, 4 words. How'd it go? I read them twice, not because I was uncertain what they said, but because I wanted to be sure that was in fact the complete message. No apology. No acknowledgement of what the night had contained. No indication that he had spent any portion of the last 7 hours wondering how I was. Just 4 words. The kind a person sends to a colleague after missing a meeting they hadn't thought was particularly important. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked at James instead. I did not reply. Somewhere in Westport, sometime around 8 that same morning, Elliot Morrow had finally checked his own phone. He told me all of this later, the sequence of it. The details, and I have reconstructed it here the way he described it. He had been working through the night the way he often did, focused on a project, noise-canceling headphones on his phone, face down on the desk beside him, because he had learned years ago that notifications were incompatible with the kind of thinking he did best. when he picked it up at 8 and saw the missed call from my number. Time-stamped at 2:14 in the morning, he understood immediately what it meant. Not the shape of it, not the specifics, just the simple fact of a missed call from me at that hour, which told him more than enough. He drove to Norwalk Hospital without calling ahead. He knew I would not want company before I had slept, and he was not there for company. He walked the parking structure until he found my SUV sitting at an angle that no one parks a car unless they have stopped caring about the geometry entirely. What he did next is something most people would not think to do. From the bag he kept in his car, he retrieved a small diagnostic reader, a device that connects to the OBD2 port present in every passenger vehicle manufactured in the United States after 1996. The port sits beneath the dashboard on the driver's side, a standardized connection point that gives access to a car's onboard computer engine data sensor readings, fault codes, and an electronic record of events the vehicle has logged. Mechanics use it routinely. Engineers use it to understand what a car's systems have actually experienced, as distinct from what the driver thought was happening. Elliot plugged the reader in, opened the corresponding application on his phone, and read through the data with the focused attention of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for and is hoping not to find it. Then he read it a second time. Then he called an automotive engineer he had worked with before, described what the data showed, and listened carefully to the response. He sat in the driver's seat of my car for a few minutes after the call ended without starting the engine. At 2:30 that afternoon, he knocked on the door of room 214. He set his laptop on the bedside table without opening it, looked at James for a brief moment with an expression I did not have the energy to fully read, and then looked at me with the specific steadiness of someone who has spent several hours preparing to say something difficult. "Before I show you anything," he said, "I need to tell you that I went to the parking lot this morning and looked at your car. And then I need to tell you something else. Something I should have told you 3 months ago." The hallway outside room 214 had gone quiet by 2:30, settling into the measured stillness that hospital corridors find between the urgency of morning rounds and the activity of the late afternoon. I had been awake for well over 12 hours, and was operating on the particular focused exhaustion that arrives when sleep is not yet something available to you, when there are still things that need to happen first. Elliot opened the laptop, turned the screen toward me, and said, "I've been monitoring your husband's network activity since December." He said it the way he says most things that matter, directly, without preamble, because he had understood years ago that I prefer information delivered straight, rather than cushioned in consideration for how it might land. That afternoon, sitting in a hospital bed 12 hours after my son's father had sent me a 4-word text, I was more grateful for that quality than I had ever been before. He started at the beginning. In December of the previous year, Elliot had noticed a shift in Preston's behavior. Not a single incident, nothing that dramatic, but an accumulation of small things that a person with a certain kind of attention registers before they can fully articulate what they are registering. Preston had started taking calls in separate rooms. He had changed the password on his personal laptop without mentioning it. He had twice in the span of 1 month suggested that Elliot's visits to our house be scheduled rather than the casual drop-ins they had always been. None of those things individually meant anything. Together, they meant enough for Elliot to do something he had spent 2 months talking himself out of. When he came over in December nominally to upgrade the home network router and improve wireless coverage in the back of the house, he also installed 3 additional security cameras in the main hallway and the living area, and configured the home network monitoring software to log every device that connected to our Wi-Fi. He told me he was upgrading the system. That was true. The rest of it he had decided to carry quietly until he had something specific enough to bring to me, something he could point to and say, "Here. This is what I was afraid of," and I was not wrong to be afraid. For 3 months, the monitoring software ran in the background without attracting any attention. The system flagged an unregistered device in January, he said. A secondary phone appearing on the network every few days, briefly, always from the same room in the house. It was connecting to one number repeatedly. I traced the number in February. He pulled up a contact profile. Vanessa Hartwell, Senior Partner, Meridian Capital Group, based in Manhattan. Below the professional headshot was a summary Elliot had built himself. Meridian's investment-focused current portfolio and the name of the company in Preston's family holdings that had been in quiet, preliminary discussions with the firm since the previous spring. I had heard the name Meridian before. 3 times in the past month, in fact, and each time I had asked Preston about it, he had redirected the conversation with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of someone who had practiced doing so without appearing to. The deal they were structuring, Elliot said, was a $50 million investment. The asset being sold was your algorithm, not the family company's, not Preston's. Yours. The code you wrote over 14 months. Gerald had represented to Meridian that the intellectual property rights had been properly acquired, which is why he needed your signature on those documents in October. He gave that a moment to settle without adding anything further. Show me the footage, I said. He opened a second window. The timestamp in the corner read 02/16/04. The camera angle covered the main hallway of our house. Looking toward the bedroom end, one of 3 cameras he had installed in December positioned in common areas with a clear sightline to the primary entry points of the house. The footage was clear. Preston came out of the bedroom 41 seconds after the front door had closed behind me. He was not groggy. He was not moving the way a person moves when they have been woken from actual sleep. He moved with the purposeful alert step of someone who had been waiting for a specific sound, the particular sound of a door closing, and was now doing the thing they had been prepared to do. He went directly to the bedside table on his side of the room, visible at the edge of the camera's angle, and retrieved something from the second drawer. A phone I had never seen before. He walked to the window with it. The call connected at 2:16:18, Elliot said. It lasted 14 minutes and 7 seconds. I watched Preston pace slowly beside the window, the same window that looked over the front driveway where my car had been sitting 30 seconds earlier. At 2:23, even through the angled footage, I could see his posture change. His shoulders dropped, and he laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a quiet one. The kind of laugh that comes from genuine relief or genuine satisfaction that does not require volume to communicate exactly what it means. 2:23, I said. Elliot looked at me. That was when I was on Post Road. My voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I was at a red light. I was the only car at the intersection. I was counting out loud to myself so I would stay focused. 2:23. Breathe. I said it out loud in the car. Elliot did not respond to that. There was nothing to add to it, and he knew it. I looked at the footage for a few more seconds. Preston at our bedroom window at 2:23 in the morning, laughing on a phone I had never known existed, and then I looked away from the screen and looked at James instead, who was asleep in the bassinet beside the bed, entirely uninvested in any of this, which was the right and sensible way for him to be. How long have you actually known? I asked. Elliot was quiet for a moment. Long enough, he said, that I was hoping I was wrong. He paused. I wasn't. We sat with that for a moment. The hallway outside continued its quiet routine. James made a small sound and resettled. There's something else, Elliot said. About the car. He minimized the footage and opened a different window. I recognized the interface, the diagnostic software from the parking lot that morning. The same data I had seen him scrolling through when he arrived. The screen now showed a full readout, columns of values, timestamps, sensor identifiers, event logs organized in dense, precise rows that meant nothing to me without someone to translate them. Before I explain what this is showing, Elliot said, I need you to take a breath. Before I show you what Elliot pulled up on that second screen, I need to know you're still with me. If you're here, drop 2:14 in the comments. That's the time I drove away alone. If you know why that number matters, you've been paying attention. A note before we continue: this story contains fictional elements created for storytelling and educational purposes. If at any point this isn't the kind of content you're looking for, it's completely okay to step away and find something that fits you better. I made Elliot say it twice. Not because I had failed to hear him. The words had arrived clearly enough, each one landing with the flat, precise weight of information that has been assembled carefully before being delivered. It was something else. Something the mind does when it receives information that requires it to restructure the world it has been operating in. It asks for the words again, not to verify the facts, but to buy itself the few extra seconds it needs before committing to what those facts mean. Elliot repeated what he had said. The words did not change. The ABS module, he said. Specifically, the electronic sensor that controls the anti-lock braking system, the mechanism that prevents your wheels from locking up during hard braking. Someone reprogrammed it. He explained it the way he explains technical things step by step without skipping, because clarity is a form of respect he extends by default. The anti-lock braking system in my SUV functions through a network of sensors that monitor wheel speed and brake pressure. Under normal circumstances, when a driver brakes sharply, the system automatically modulates the braking force to prevent wheel lockup, which allows the driver to maintain steering control instead of skidding. It is standard safety equipment in every modern vehicle, and most drivers never think about it until it saves their life. Someone had accessed the ABS module through my car's onboard diagnostic port, the same port Elliot had used that morning, and rewritten a specific set of operating instructions. The modification was invisible. No warning lights, no change in how the pedal felt at low speeds or during routine stops. Nothing that any driver or any standard mechanical inspection would detect without the right diagnostic software and the specific knowledge of what to look for. The modification had one purpose triggered by one condition. If the vehicle reached 35 miles per hour and maintained that speed for 12 consecutive minutes, the ABS module would receive a command to cut out completely. Not degrade, gradually. Cut. At that point, any emergency braking would result in immediate wheel lockup. The car would skid, rather than stop, particularly on a road that had been rain-dampened during the day and not yet dried by midnight. She would have to physically have access to the car, I said. Or he would. Someone with physical access long enough to use the port. Under 5 minutes, Elliot said, for someone who knew the vehicle's system in advance and came prepared. Why didn't it activate? Because the trigger conditions were never completed. He turned the laptop slightly so I could see the data log on the screen. Your speed fluctuated every 3 to 4 minutes throughout the drive. Each time a contraction hit your right foot came partially off the accelerator. The speed dropped the threshold reset, and the 12-minute count started over. The condition never ran to completion. I thought about the drive, the counting. The way my foot had moved without my making a conscious decision to move it, a reflex of pain, the body prioritizing the contraction over everything else, including the accelerator. 222, I said. The curve, just past Campo Road. He nodded. Your speed had been building. You were at 33 miles per hour for about 90 seconds before the turn. When you applied the brake for the curve, the system hesitated not enough to cause an accident at that speed, but enough to register a delayed response before the ABS module corrected. That's the moment you noticed. I remembered the curve. The fraction of a second where the pedal felt different, where something underneath my foot did not respond the way I expected it to. I had flexed my ankle pressed again, felt normal resistance, and attributed the whole thing to the state of my nervous system. It had not been my nervous system. Elliot closed the diagnostic window. He opened a second document, one I had not seen before, and set the laptop on the table so I could read the screen without craning toward it. It was a life insurance policy. The name of the insured was mine. The face value of the policy was $4,200,000. The application was dated October 14th of the previous year, 6 months ago. The policy had been purchased by Gerald. The sole named beneficiary was Preston. I read it from the first line to the last. Then I read it again from the beginning, not because I had missed anything the first time, but because the mind, apparently, was going to keep asking for second passes tonight. October 14th, I said. Elliot did not say anything. I finished the final build of the algorithm on October 11th. I could hear my own voice from a slight distance, the way you hear yourself when part of your attention has moved somewhere else entirely. Gerald came to the house 3 days later, 3 days after the codebase was complete, and the algorithm was worth $50 million to the right buyer. Gerald had arrived at my kitchen table with a leather folder and a stack of documents that required my signature. I had been 6 months pregnant and exhausted, and I had trusted a man who had apparently spent the intervening 72 hours calculating how much my life was worth dead. 6 months ago, I said. The same week I finished the algorithm. That was when they decided. Elliot still did not say anything. He understood, as I did, that there was nothing useful to add to that sentence. I set the laptop aside and stood up slowly, my body registering its objections, but ultimately cooperating. I crossed the room to the window. From the 3rd floor of Norwalk Hospital, the parking structure was visible at an angle, its open levels lit by fluorescent strips that ran all night, indifferent to the hour. On the 2nd level, I could see my SUV, still sitting at the off-center angle I had parked it in at 2:38 that morning. Someone had sat in that car, had plugged a device into the port beneath my steering column, had written instructions into the brake module that were designed to activate on the specific kind of long, late-night drive that a woman alone in labor might take. Had then walked away and left the car in the driveway and gone inside to wait. I had been looking at the parking structure for a while before I realized Elliot had gone quiet behind me. I turned around. His expression was careful in the specific way of someone who has one more thing and is deciding how to begin. "Nora," he said, measured, deliberate. "When did you last open your prenatal vitamins, and who was the last person who had unsupervised access to your kitchen?" The dinner tray had been cleared by the time Elliot reached into his bag and set a printed photograph on the bedside table in front of me. The hallway outside had shifted to the quieter rhythm that hospital evenings find somewhere around 9, the purposeful activity of daytime replaced by something more watchful and contained. The overhead lights in the corridor had been dimmed. James was in the bassinet, settled after a feeding, breathing in the steady, industrious way of someone who has recently done something significant and is properly recovering from it. Elliot set the photograph down without saying anything first. He let me look. It had been taken through a window. The angle was from outside the house, from the narrow side yard between the main structure and the property fence, a position that would be invisible from the street, but that had a clear, unobstructed view through the kitchen window. In the photograph, the kitchen island was visible, the cabinet above the sink, and the particular corner of the counter where I kept my prenatal vitamins in the same place every morning, because routine was something I had tried to hold on to during the pregnancy when very little else felt stable. Constance Calloway was standing at that counter. Her back was partially turned toward the window, but not fully enough that the angle caught the motion of her right hand extended toward the cabinet, and her left hand held at a level consistent with someone managing something small, something palm-sized. The timestamp in the corner read, March 20th, 3 weeks before James was born. I remembered the visit. It had been a Thursday afternoon. Constance had called approximately an hour before, more notice than she usually gave, and not enough to feel like a planned occasion. She said she was in the area and had made a casserole she wanted to drop off, which was the first time in 4 years of marriage that Constance had brought food to our house for any reason other than a catered event she had organized herself. I had accepted it with the particular calibrated gratitude you offer when someone does something unexpected that you have not yet decided what to make of. We had spoken briefly in the entryway. She had followed me to the kitchen when I offered tea. She had been in the kitchen while I took a call in the adjacent dining room. 12 minutes, approximately the length of the call I could no longer remember the content of. 12 minutes alone in a kitchen with a clear view of the cabinet where my vitamins were kept in a bottle that was opened and closed every morning and that I had never thought to look at twice. "Elliot," I said. "You called my doctor." "Before I came up this afternoon," he said. "With your permission, I called Dr. Fields while I was still in the parking structure and asked her to pull your delivery blood work. She reviewed it and called me back." He had it written down, a summary of what Dr. Fields had explained. Organized the way Elliot organizes things, he needs someone else to understand clearly. I read it while he spoke. Misoprostol is a medication used in obstetric medicine under controlled clinical conditions, prescribed by physicians to initiate or accelerate labor when medically necessary, to ripen the cervix in preparation for delivery, or to manage certain complications of pregnancy. It works by binding to receptors in the smooth muscle of the uterus and triggering contractions. The dosage and administration are carefully managed because the body's response to the drug is highly sensitive to quantity and timing. Too little, and there is no effect. Too much, administered without monitoring, and the results can be rapid, intense, and dangerous. The level of misoprostol in my blood work the morning of April 11th was not consistent with natural labor onset. Dr. Fields had told Elliot that the level suggested gradual accumulation over several days, small amounts, that would not on any given day produce a detectable response, but which would build until the body reached a threshold and responded. The night of April 11th, she said that threshold had been crossed. What presented to me as labor beginning on its own terms in its own time at 1:47 in the morning had in fact been initiated by something that had been introduced into my body without my knowledge or consent. The same night, someone had modified my car's brake sensor to activate at highway speed. I lifted James from the bassinet carefully, both hands, the way you hold something you understand now, in a way you did not understand an hour ago, and pressed him against my chest for a moment. He stirred, made a small sound of mild protest at the interruption, and resettled. I placed him back into the bassinet and kept my hands on the padded edge of it for a few seconds longer than the transfer required. My hands were shaking. Not from pain, not from exhaustion. From the particular cold trembling that arrives when the mind finally accounts for the distance between what a person has survived and what was designed to happen instead. I had been standing in a kitchen at 2 in the morning. I had been driving alone on a dark road at 2:22. I had arrived at a hospital, and I had had a son, And I was in this room. None of it had been an accident. All of it had been someone else's plan. This was not neglect, I said. My voice was steady in the way that things go steady past a certain point of understanding, not composure, but the absence of anything left to brace against. This was not cruelty in the ordinary sense of the word. This was a plan with a sequence and a timeline and a specific financial outcome attached to it. Yes, Elliot said. Who took that photograph? I was still looking at the bassinet. Dorothy, he said. I turned around and looked at Elliot. He looked back. Dorothy Calloway, Preston's grandmother. 78 years old, a small house in Fairfield, a woman the family discussed in the careful, slightly quieter register, people reserve for those they believe are no longer fully following along. At family dinners, she sometimes repeated questions she had asked 20 minutes earlier. Preston had mentioned more than once that she had good days and harder days, and that it was becoming more difficult to reach her. I had thought of her, if I am being fully honest about the attention I had paid, as peripheral, background. One of the inherited figures of a life I was still, after 4 years, only partly inside. I sat down on the edge of the bed. A person who had been standing outside a kitchen window in March with a camera was not peripheral. Had not been peripheral, apparently, for some time. That evening, sometime after 9, a nurse knocked on the door of room 214 and extended a small envelope toward me. My name was written on the front carefully, deliberately, in the kind of handwriting that takes more time than most people give it and intends to be read clearly. The nurse said a woman had left it at the front reception desk that afternoon and asked that it be delivered to me directly. She had not given her name. The envelope was still on the bedside table when she walked in. Dorothy Calloway arrived at room 214 at 10:15 Saturday morning, carrying a paper bag from the hospital gift shop in one hand and a small potted plant with a yellow ribbon tied around the base in the other. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan over a floral blouse, and she moved through the doorway with the measured, slightly tentative gait that I had come to associate with her over 4 years of family occasions. Careful steps, a slight pause at thresholds, a way of taking in a room that looked, from the outside, like gentle disorientation. She glanced around the room with an expression of mild, pleasant uncertainty. She smiled at James in the bassinet. She smiled at me with the specific warmth of someone who is happy to see you and is not entirely sure what your name is. Then she closed the door. She set the bag on the windowsill, placed the plant beside it, and pulled the chair from the corner of the room directly to the side of the bed. She sat down with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and looked at me with eyes that were neither mild nor uncertain. They were blue, a clear, pale blue, and they were completely, entirely awake. They moved over the room with the quick, comprehensive attention of someone who has made a habit of reading situations before other people realize they are being read. I don't have much time, she said. Her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. No wandering quality, no half-finished sentences. Clear and precise. The voice of a woman who had prepared what she wanted to say and was going to say it efficiently. They think I'm in the gift shop. I told the nurse at the desk I was looking for the elevator. I looked at her for a moment. The envelope, she said, with a brief glance at the bedside table. I left that yesterday afternoon. A precaution in the event that something prevented me from getting to you directly. The drive is inside it. Everything I have collected is on it. But I wanted to be here when you opened it, or at least to explain what you are looking at before you do. She settled her hands more firmly in her lap as though closing a parenthesis. I have been pretending to lose my memory for 2 years, she said. She said it with no particular emphasis, the way a person describes a professional method they have employed successfully and see no reason to apologize for. Not completely, that would have been difficult to sustain and unnecessary. Just enough. Just enough to be the person in the room that Gerald stops accounting for. Just enough to be the one no one lowers their voice for. She paused. People never watch someone they have already decided doesn't matter. Gerald decided I didn't matter sometime in the fall of 2021. It is the most useful decision he has ever made from my perspective. In 2022, she told me she had started noticing changes in how the family's assets were being managed. Decisions that had historically required her approval. She held a significant founding interest in the family company. A fact I had not known and which she mentioned without elaboration were being moved forward without her signature or input. When she asked questions, Gerald responded with the patient, concerned tone of a son managing a parent who is becoming difficult to reach. He suggested gently that she might be misremembering. That perhaps those conversations had already happened and she simply did not recall them. She had understood immediately what was happening. "I let him think it was working," she said. "I repeated myself at dinner. I confused dates. I asked questions I had asked 20 minutes earlier. It required less effort than you might expect. Gerald was already inclined to see decline, so I gave him more of it. I became the background. And then I watched, and I copied, and I waited. For 14 months she had copied documents, bank records, internal correspondence contracts, financial instruments material she still had legitimate access to as a founding shareholder, though that access had been increasingly and quietly narrowed. She had sent copies to a private attorney in New Haven, a woman with no connection to the Calloway family, who had been holding the files under attorney-client privilege. In October of last year, Dorothy continued, I had myself independently assessed at Yale New Haven Hospital. 2 neurologists selected by my attorney with no prior relationship to this family, both concluded in writing that I am fully legally competent. That documentation is in my attorney's possession. If Gerald ever attempts to formalize any claim regarding my capacity, it will be answered. She said it the way a person describes a tool they have maintained in readiness and have not yet needed to use. The files on the drive will show you the shape of what has been built, she said. The contracts, the insurance, the transfers, and there is a video file. I need you to watch that one when you feel ready, not before. It is the hardest thing on the drive, but it is also the most important. She stood then and looked at James. Something shifted in her face, not performance this time, but something that happened without her directing it. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was simply old and tired and glad. He has your eyes, she said quietly. I could see it the moment they placed him. Your eyes, exactly. A pause. Thank God. She did not say more on the subject. She straightened, smoothed the front of her cardigan, and took the empty paper bag from the windowsill, folding it once and tucking it under her arm as though completing a small errand. I won't return today, she said. It would attract attention. Someone from the family's side will come by before this evening, and I would prefer things appear undisturbed. She turned toward the door. And then, between one step and the next, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, Dorothy Calloway rearranged herself. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. A softening at the corners of the mouth, a slight slackening of the jaw, a change in the quality of her gaze, from focused to gently unfixed. By the time her hand found the door handle, the sharp blue eyes had become the mild wandering eyes of an old woman who had found herself somewhere she had not quite intended. She opened the door and walked out into the corridor. To anyone who saw her, she would have looked exactly like a grandmother who had drifted into the wrong room and was finding her quiet way back toward wherever she had meant to be. For 2 years she had not drifted anywhere by accident. The rain had started sometime before 7, tapping against the hospital window in the unhurried way of April weather that has nowhere particular to go, not a storm. Just a steady gray commentary on the morning. Elliot had arrived before Dorothy before 10:15, before the conversation in the hallway, before any of it. By the time Dorothy left, he was still in the chair, beside the bed where he had been since 7. He had not moved. The laptop was open on the table. A coffee cup sat at the near edge of the bedside table, still giving off a thin thread of steam. He had not turned on the overhead light. He was reading something on the screen, with the focused quiet of someone who has been awake long enough to be past the point of restlessness and into the territory of simple waiting. How long have you been here? I asked. 7, he said. He did not look up. Take your time. He meant with the morning, with the coffee, with whatever it was going to cost to look at what was on the drive. James was still asleep. I sat up, carefully reached for the coffee warm enough, and watched Elliot take the USB drive from his jacket pocket. He had taken it from the envelope after Dorothy left that morning and had not opened it. He had been waiting until I was awake and present, which was its own kind of quiet consideration from a person who had already been sitting in a hospital chair since 7 in the morning. He plugged the drive in. The file directory populated on the screen 9 individual files organized into 3 folders. He rotated the laptop so we could both read the screen without either of us having to crane, and we began at the beginning. The first file was the photograph from the kitchen window, the same one Elliot had printed and shown me the night before. Seeing it on the full screen, larger and with more resolution than the print, did not make it easier. The timestamp. The angle. Constance's hand extended toward the cabinet. Confirmation carries its own weight separate from the weight of original discovery. We move to the second folder. One document. 22 pages formatted with the clean, precise language of a legal agreement, party identification, scope of transfer, representations, and warranties, signature block at the end. The title at the top read, Assignment of Intellectual Property Rights. The intellectual property being assigned was described in a schedule attached at the back, an algorithmic framework, and all associated code documentation, and derivative works developed by a named individual between January 2022 and October 2023. The named individual was me. The assigner, the party transferring the rights, was me. The assignee, the party receiving them, was an entity called Callaway Family Holdings Group Incorporated in Delaware, which I had heard mentioned once or twice in the context of family business, and had never had a reason to think about specifically. The stated consideration for the transfer of 14 months of my professional work, the system I had built from first principles, revised twice, debugged across 3 deployment environments, and had still been refining the morning my labor started, was $1 and other valuable consideration. In American contract law, a transfer of property requires what is called consideration, something of value exchanged between the parties, to make the agreement legally binding. $1 satisfies that requirement on paper. It is a standard device in IP assignment agreements when the real benefit to the assigner is understood to be something other than a direct payment, employment equity, a licensing arrangement. In this case, there was no accompanying benefit. There was $1 and a signature, and a highlighted line on page 11 of a document stack that Gerald had described as standard family trust paperwork. The signature on the last page was mine. The date was October 14th. I had been 6 months pregnant, and Gerald had stood at my kitchen table with a leather folder organized into tidy sections with adhesive tabs marking each place that needed a signature. He had moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, pointing, explaining briefly, moving to the next tab. Standard. Annual. Routine. He had not left the room. He had sat across from me and made pleasant conversation about the weather and the upcoming holidays, while I signed where he indicated. Page 11 had a yellow highlighted line. I had signed it. I had not read what was above the highlighted line. There's another one, Elliot said. He had navigated to the third folder. Another document from the same packet, same fonts, same formatting, same adhesive tab placement scheme. Page 19. The life insurance policy. I had already seen the summary Elliot had prepared from his March research, but reading the full document now, within the same file as the IP transfer, knowing that both had been in the same leather folder on the same kitchen table, signed with the same pen during the same 40-minute visit on a Thursday afternoon in October, made the afternoon visible in a way that no summary could have conveyed. Gerald had walked into my house carrying 2 things. He had walked out with 2 signatures. One transferred the rights to what I had spent 14 months building. The other established a financial instrument that converted my death into $4,200,000 with Preston as the sole beneficiary. 2 documents. 1 afternoon. The organizational efficiency of it was almost impressive if you could get far enough away from what it actually meant. I could not get that far away from it. The 4th folder held bank records. Statements from an account I had no prior knowledge of, opened jointly in both my name and Preston's. The account paperwork routed to a mailbox registered to a business address connected to Gerald's company, the statements never sent to our home. A joint account on paper that I had never signed for and never known existed. Over 8 months, $847,000 had moved from that account into a private account registered solely to Preston. 17 separate transfers. Amounts calibrated. Elliot had noted this at the bottom of his summary, to fall below the thresholds that trigger automatic review by financial institutions. Not large enough to raise flags individually, cumulatively, not small. The source of the funds in the joint account was a household financial instrument I had co-signed 3 years ago when we were refinancing the house, the details of which I had not revisited since. The money had been mine in the most technical sense of the word, before it became Preston's. I set the laptop back on the table and looked at my hands for a moment. I had been funding my own destruction, one signature at a time. I looked at James, who was asleep in the bassinet with his characteristic seriousness, unaware that the woman watching him had just read a document trail that accounted for nearly every significant decision she had made in the past year, and found her own name listed repeatedly as a cooperative participant in a plan she had known nothing about. And I thought briefly privately, in the specific way that a person thinks about a thing they are not yet ready to say out loud, about a sequence of code I had written into the algorithm during its final build phase. Something I had embedded without explaining my reasoning to anyone, in the way an engineer sometimes installs a failsafe before she has articulated to herself exactly what she is guarding against. I did not say anything about it. "There's one more file," Elliot said. He moved the cursor to the last item in the directory and stopped. He looked at me across the laptop screen. "This one isn't a document," he said. "Dorothy told me to make sure you were ready before we opened it." He paused. "Are you—" Before I play you what was on that recording, pause for a second and comment, "I stayed, so I know you're still here." What you're about to hear is the moment everything became impossible to deny. Quick note, parts of this story are fictional, shaped for narrative and educational purposes. If this type of content isn't for you, this is a good place to stop. No hard feelings. The file was a video. The date stamp in the lower corner of the thumbnail read, December 18th of the previous year, the week of Gerald's birthday dinner, an occasion I remembered with the specific, unhappy clarity of an evening I had tried very hard to make go well. I had been 8 months pregnant. I had spent 2 hours that afternoon making a chocolate layer cake from scratch because Constance had mentioned weeks earlier that it was Gerald's favorite, a mention I had taken as an implied request, because that was how requests generally arrived from that side of the family. Wrapped in information rather than stated directly, I had shown up to that dinner having done something kind and effortful, and I had sat at the table for 40 minutes before Preston had put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, in the careful, slightly apologetic tone he used when he was managing a situation, that the adults needed to discuss some business matters, and it might be more comfortable for me upstairs. I had taken my dessert plate. I had climbed the stairs. I had eaten cake in the guest room alone, and told myself it was tax matters or something legal, or a family financial discussion that predated me and was simply not mine to sit in on. I had not argued. I had not asked what kind of business required the pregnant woman to leave the room. I had gone upstairs. I had closed the door. Now Elliot pressed play, and I was about to hear what I had closed the door on. The footage had been captured by a security camera mounted in the upper corner of Dorothy's living room, the space where the table was set for family dinners. Visible at the edge of the frame, placed on a side table near the entrance to the room, was a small framed sign, "Security camera in use." In Connecticut. Recording in a private residence with a clearly posted notice at the point of entry establishes implied consent from anyone who enters that space. The law distinguishes between covert surveillance and disclosed security recording. Dorothy had posted that sign when she installed the camera 2 years ago. She had placed it at the correct height, in the correct position, and she had understood precisely what she was building and what it would one day need to hold. Gerald and Constance and Preston had seen that sign every time they entered the room. They had seen it and had not changed what they said inside it, because they believed, with the particular confidence that comes from having already dismissed someone, that Dorothy no longer processed what was happening around her. They had been wrong. She had simply stopped telling them otherwise. The camera angle covered most of the dining table. The audio was clear and uninterrupted. Gerald sat at the head of the table, the position that communicated without any announcement who was running the meeting. Constance sat to his left. Preston sat opposite Gerald, back partially toward the camera. The remains of the birthday dinner were still on the table. On the sideboard at the far edge of the frame, the chocolate layer cake I had made was visible, one slice already gone. Gerald spoke first. "If she miscarries, all the better." His voice was level and measured, the tone he used when discussing quarterly projections. Not lowered, not hesitant, the voice of a man who had already made the decision and was now simply communicating the logistics. "If not, we wait until after the delivery. We need the child for the inheritance clause. After that, let Constance handle the rest." Constance reached for her wine glass. She did not look up. "The car sensor has already been taken care of," she said. Gerald looked at Preston. Preston did not speak. I counted the silence 4 seconds, the same way I had been counting things since the hallway at 1:47 in the morning, as though numbers could provide structure to what language was no longer adequate for. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then Preston said, "Okay, one word. The word you use when someone suggests a meeting time that works for you, or a restaurant you have no strong feelings about, or a minor adjustment to a plan that was already mostly settled. A word with no gravity in it. A word that a person who was being misled or coerced, or who genuinely did not understand what they were agreeing to, does not say. A person who does not understand what they are agreeing to asks a question. A person who objects says something. A person who is surprised takes more than 4 seconds to respond and does not arrive at a single flat syllable. 4 seconds, then okay. Preston had sat at that table with his father and his mother and heard every word of what was being proposed, and he had taken 4 seconds and he had said, okay. I reached into the bassinet and lifted James out with both hands carefully and held him against my chest for a moment without saying anything. Then I placed him back more slowly than the transfer required because my hands needed something precise and manageable to do in that particular moment. I straightened. I walked to the window. The parking structure below was lit in the flat, indifferent way it was lit at every hour. My car was on the second level, still crooked in its space. Constance had arranged for what was done to it. Gerald had purchased my life insurance before the arrangement was made. Preston had been present for the conversation in which the plan was described and had chosen one word, and that word had been okay. I stood at the window for 2 full minutes. I did not count this time. Behind me, Elliot said nothing. He had closed the laptop when the video ended, and he was sitting in the chair with the particular stillness of someone who has decided correctly that the most useful thing available to him in this moment is simply not adding to it. 6 years of friendship had produced this quality in him, the understanding that presence does not require noise. I turned from the window. There is a point in the process of understanding that you have been systematically betrayed, where the emotional experience of it, the shock, the grief, the specific cold precision of recognizing what someone was willing to do stops being the thing that occupies the front of the mind. Not because it is gone, because something else steps in front of it. Something that has less to do with feeling and more to do with direction. I had reached that point somewhere between Gerald's voice and Preston's 4-second silence. "Call Diana," I said. My voice was different, not the voice I had been using for 3 days. Not the voice of a woman absorbing and managing and holding herself upright. Flat. Clear. Pointed at a specific thing. Tell her to bring everything she needs to file a criminal complaint. All of it. Elliot picked up his phone. He knew better than to ask whether I was sure. Diana was an attorney, a friend from the years before the marriage, who had built a civil litigation and criminal defense practice in Stamford, and who had once, early in my relationship with Preston, told me with the quiet directness of someone who means what they say, "If you ever need me, call me first. Before anything else. Call me first." Elliot sent a message. 3 minutes later, the phone lit up on the table. "She wants to speak with you directly," he said. I took the phone. I dialed. Diana picked up on the second ring. I did not say hello. I said, "How fast can you get to Norwalk Hospital?" 1 beat of silence. Then her voice steady and already moving. "I'll be there by 7. Diana arrived at 7:10, exactly the kind of punctuality that communicates professional intention rather than social habit. She was carrying 2 coffee cups from the hospital cafeteria and a yellow legal pad. And she moved into the room with the particular composure that some attorneys develop through years of difficult cases. Not the composure of someone unaffected by what they are about to hear, but of someone who has learned to keep the engine running regardless of the road. She set 1 cup on the table beside me without comment. She pulled the chair to the side of the bed, opened the legal pad to a fresh page, and looked at me. "All of it," she said. "From the beginning." I told her everything. Not just from April 11th forward, from December when Elliot had first begun watching the network activity, the ABS sensor and what the OBD2 data showed, the vitamins and what Dr. Fields had confirmed about the misoprostol levels, the IP transfer agreement hidden in the tax packet, the insurance policy on page 19 of the same stack, the bank account, the 17 transfers, $847,000 moved in amounts calibrated to avoid automatic review, the video from Dorothy's living room, the camera, the posted sign, Gerald's voice, Constance's confirmation, and the 4 seconds before Preston said, "Okay," and then the part I had not originally intended to include in a list of evidence, but which Diana's expression told me she needed to hear. Constance and Tatum had been at the house that night. I told her about the kitchen, the wine glass, Tatum on her laptop with 1 earpiece in, the contractions starting in the hallway, and the walk through the door, and the 2 women who had looked at me, a 39-week pregnant woman in a wet nightgown telling them she could not reach a driver and needed someone to take her to the hospital, and had responded with a concern for hardwood floors and a 20-minute call with Meridian's Tokyo office. Constance's last words before she left. Text Preston when you're admitted. He'll want to know how it goes. Diana was writing. She had been writing since I started. She did not stop when I finished. She filled half a page and then she turned it over and kept going. And when she finally put the pen down, it was not because she had run out of things to note, but because she had organized everything she needed. 5 counts, she said, not 4 or 5. The presence of Constance and Tatum at the house changes the conspiracy charge significantly. This is no longer a plan executed at a distance. They were in the room. They observed an emergency in progress. Constance had specifically arranged for the conditions of that emergency. She then declined to render any assistance and left the scene. Diana paused. Under Connecticut conspiracy law, active participation includes being present for the execution of a plan you helped arrange and choosing to allow it to proceed. Their departure before 2:16, just before Preston made his call to Vanessa, suggests coordination, not coincidence. She turned to a new page. Conspiracy to commit assault with serious physical risk, Constance, Preston, Gerald, with Tatum as a secondary participant. Insurance fraud, Gerald and Preston. IP fraud, Gerald and Preston. Financial fraud, Preston with Gerald's infrastructure. And witness to a crime in progress with deliberate non-assistance, which elevates Constance's role from co-conspirator to active facilitator. A pause. That is state and federal exposure across 4 individuals. Gerald organized it. Constance executed 2 of the most critical components and was present for a third. Preston agreed to all of it in writing on camera in 1 word, and Tatum facilitated the financial vehicle. She looked at me directly. The video is the center of this. Everything else corroborates it. But that recording is the core. There's one more thing, I said, about the algorithm itself. Diana put her pen down. I told her about the logic bomb, the sequence of code I had embedded during the final development phase, invisible during testing or any operational review, dormant until one specific condition: the confirmation of a wire transfer of investment capital to the account associated with the family company. When that transfer completed, every device running the algorithm would receive a deletion command. The code would remove every file, every directory, every cached instance of itself. Nothing written to external systems. Nothing accessed that the code had not itself installed. Self-contained deletion, Elliot said from his chair. No payload, no external write, no system access beyond the algorithm's own components. It executes the deletion and terminates. Whatever was on those machines before the algorithm arrived remains completely undisturbed. Diana looked at him for a moment, then at me. A logic bomb is a piece of code designed to execute a defined function when a specific trigger condition is met. She said, establishing the legal frame before building inside it. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, criminal liability requires knowingly accessing a protected computer without authorization and causing damage. The key question is whether deleting your own code from devices where it was installed without your legal consent constitutes damage. She picked up the pen. The IP transfer agreement was obtained through fraudulent inducement, a contract that is voidable under Connecticut law. If voided, the transfer of ownership never legally occurred. You remain the rightful owner. Every device currently running that code is running it without your authorization. She underlined something. Removing your own property from places it was never lawfully placed is not damage under the statute. There is civil IP precedent for that argument. I can build a complete defense around it if it ever becomes necessary. She looked up. As long as it only deletes itself and leaves external systems undisturbed, you are not criminally liable. You are the rightful owner, reclaiming stolen property through a mechanism you had the foresight to build before it was taken from you. I thought about the night I had written it. October, late alone in the house with the cursor blinking and the algorithm nearly complete, and something in the back of my mind that had decided, quietly and without explanation, that a way out was worth building before the door closed. Wednesday, Elliot said. He turned his laptop toward us, a calendar entry, April 17th, Meridian Capital, Midtown Manhattan. Tatum Calloway has a pitch meeting with Vanessa Hartwell. 4 days. Tatum, who had sat at my kitchen counter at 2 a.m. and told me to use the rideshare app. Who had a call with Tokyo at 2:30 and had not once looked up from her screen. Who had the algorithm now and no idea what was sitting inside it. She doesn't know, I said. Neither does Vanessa, Elliot said. Tatum has the code. Vanessa has $50 million. Neither one knows what they're about to exchange. Diana looked at me. We let them pitch. We let them receive the wire. Then Elliot handles his part. I looked at James in the bassinet. 2 in the morning in a Connecticut kitchen felt very far away and very close at the same time. They had believed they were taking everything. They had taken my signature, my code, my money, and my algorithm, and they had taken the night I should never have had to drive alone. They had believed that left me with nothing. They had also handed me the detonator. There's something Dorothy hasn't told you yet, Elliot said. He closed the laptop. About who actually owns this company. About what's in her will. He looked at me. We need her here tomorrow morning. Dorothy arrived at 9 in the morning without the paper bag. No cookies, no small potted plant from the gift shop. No cover story prepared at the door. She came through in the same pale blue cardigan. But the performance was already gone before she crossed the threshold, dropped somewhere between the elevator and the hallway, with the deliberate economy of someone who no longer needs it. She looked at the room, at me, at Diana, across the bed, with her legal pad at Elliot by the window, at James in the bassinet. The assessment in her blue eyes was exactly what it had been the morning before, wearing nothing to soften it. She looked at Diana. You must be the attorney, she said. Diana Walsh. Yes. Good, Dorothy said. She pulled the chair to the side of the table, sat down with her back straight, and set a manila envelope on the surface between them. Metal clasped, no writing on the outside. She did not open it immediately. Gerald has a will, she said. He had it prepared 18 months ago and has been operating under the assumption that it represents my final wishes. I want to be specific. He did not find that document in my home, my files, or any location I authorized. He arranged to have it drafted through a firm his company has used for years. Using a version of my signature obtained from a document I signed in 2019, and he has been holding it as though it were legitimate. I am aware of its contents. It designates Gerald as the primary beneficiary of my estate and transfers my company shares to a structure he controls entirely. She unclasped the envelope and removed a document, 7 pages heavyweight paper, the raised seal of a notary public embossed at the bottom of the signature page. I executed this 3 years ago, she said, placing it on the table in front of Diana. Independent counsel, independent notary, no one with any professional connection to this family. The original has been in a private safe deposit box at a bank in New Haven since the day it was signed. The attorney who drafted it holds a certified copy. I arranged no further contact with her after the document was completed, specifically so that no one could credibly argue that either of us had altered it. Diana read. Her eyes moved through the pages with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly where the relevant language will be and is moving directly toward it. She slowed at the 4th page. She read it twice, then looked up. 51%, she said. Of the founding shares, Dorothy confirmed, which represents controlling interest in the company as established by the original shareholder agreement signed at incorporation. Gerald holds 26%. The remaining 23% is distributed among 2 other original parties. My 51% has always been mine, not managed by Gerald, not subject to his authority mine. Whatever he has represented to investors or lenders about his control of this company has been built on an assumption I never authorized. Diana turned to the notary page. She noted the commission number, the date, the county of execution. I can verify this today, she said. Commission records are public in Connecticut. I know, Dorothy said. That is why I chose that notary specifically. Diana set the will on the table. 51% to James Calloway. She read, with his mother designated as legal guardian and trustee of the interest until James reaches the age of 25. Yes. Diana was quiet for a moment, not hesitating but recalibrating. The way a person pauses when a case they thought they understood has just added a significant new dimension. She turned to me. I need to be clear about what this document accomplishes immediately and what it doesn't. A will does not transfer ownership upon signing or even upon death without court involvement. In Connecticut, the estate goes through probate. The probate court authenticates the document, resolves any contests, and formally executes the transfer. Given that Gerald holds a competing document, this will almost certainly be challenged. That process could take months, possibly longer if he pursues active litigation. She let that settle, then continued. But here is what this will does right now. Before a single probate hearing is scheduled, it establishes a documented, independently verified competing claim to controlling interest in that company. I can file for a preliminary injunction in Superior Court this afternoon, an emergency motion requesting that the court freeze all asset transfers, liquidations, or financial encumbrances related to the company, while the criminal case and the probate dispute are both pending. That means Gerald cannot sell, the company cannot use company assets as collateral, cannot distribute funds to himself or any related party. Not while this is in front of a court. She closed the document. The asset freeze is what we need before Wednesday. That is the immediate goal. Probate is the longer road. Dorothy had turned her attention to the bassinet while Diana spoke. James was awake, not fussing, simply present, doing the quiet, attentive work of a person still learning what being in the world requires. He was looking at nothing in particular with the particular gravity of someone for whom everything is still new. The room went quiet. "I raised Gerald," Dorothy said. Her voice was the same clear, precise voice it always was now, but something had moved closer to the surface. "I raised him, and I told him, from the time he was very young, that money was protection. That if you built enough of it and held it carefully, it would keep the people you loved safe from whatever came. I believed it when I said it." A pause. "I was wrong. I taught him that money was the point, not the means. And then I watched him teach the same thing to his son. And I watched them both arrange what they arranged, and I told myself for a long time that I was misreading the situation, because the alternative was not something I was ready to look at directly." She looked at James. "I am sorry," she said. "Not to me, to him. To a 4-day-old person who would not understand it for years, and who deserved to hear it said out loud by someone in this family regardless." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. I did not say anything. She did not need me to. She had carried that sentence for a long time, and she had finally set it down. And the most honest thing I could offer her was simply to be there when she did. Dorothy looked at my hand on hers. She straightened. The precision returned to her face. Not performance. Just the bearing of a woman who has done what she came to do and is ready to think about what comes next. 4 days, Elliot said from the window. He was looking at his phone. He set it down on the windowsill and looked at us. "The pitch is Wednesday, so here is exactly what we are going to do, and we only have one shot at this." The discharge paperwork was completed by 9:45 in the morning, which gave Nurse Patricia time to appear in the hallway outside room 214 with an infant car seat that she had apparently arranged the previous day, retrieved from a storage closet with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been thinking ahead without being asked. She helped me buckle James in. Her hands moved with the practiced certainty of someone who has done this particular task more times than memory can account for, adjusting the harness, checking the clip, running a thumb under the strap to confirm the fit. When we reached the automatic doors at the hospital entrance, she held them open and walked out into the April morning with us. "Come back if you need anything," she said. She said it with the specific weight that turns an ordinary sentence into something else, the weight of a person communicating that she is aware of what you have been through in this building and what you are about to walk back into. I looked at her in the pale morning light and understood for the first time clearly that she had known the shape of my situation from approximately the moment Officer Dale had met me at the entrance 5 days ago. She had known it, and she had chosen, every day since, to be present without making it a conversation I had to have. "Thank you," I said, "for everything you didn't say." She gave me the brief, contained nod of a person who considers acknowledgement unnecessary and does not want to make a moment out of it. Then she turned and walked back through the sliding doors, and the doors closed behind her, and James and I stood in the April air for a moment before I carried him to the car. The drive from Norwalk to Westport was 11 miles on a Tuesday morning. Familiar roads in familiar daylight, the same route I had driven dozens of times, lined with the same Connecticut houses and gas stations and hardware stores that had always been there. The difference was the weight in the car seat behind me. The difference was that I checked the mirrors twice as often as I needed to, and kept both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, and the pedal response was exactly what it should be, and I did not count anything out loud. Elliot had left the hospital at 7. When I pulled into the driveway at 10:47, he was standing at the front door with a new key he had cut that morning, and the locks had already been changed and the smart home panel had been reset to a code that only the two of us knew. Motion sensors on every entrance and exit point, he said, moving aside so I could come through. New camera system feeds go to your phone and mine simultaneously. If the alarm triggers and you don't respond within 60 seconds, the monitoring company calls the police directly. He took the car seat from me while I got the door fully open. I also pulled the previous system's access log. Preston hasn't tried the code yet. When he does, it won't work. Inside the house looked exactly the same. The entryway, the hardwood floors, the kitchen at the back, the white countertops. The cabinet above the sink standing open and empty. I had removed what was in it before we left for the hospital the previous day, on Diana's instruction, as part of preserving the chain of evidence. Everything else where it had always been. Light falling through the windows at the same angles it always did at this hour on a clear morning. I stood in the entryway for a moment and understood something I had been approaching for several days, without quite arriving at that nothing about this house had ever looked different. All of it had happened in rooms that looked exactly like this. Preston's name appeared on my phone 7 times before noon. I watched the notifications arrive one after another and did not pick up. Constance sent a text at 11:15 that used the word consequences twice and referenced the family's attorney by name, a name I recognized now from the internal company correspondence on the USB drive, which gave the message a different quality than she had probably intended. I read it once and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. At 11:30, Gerald called. Elliot picked up. He did not say anything. He held the phone to his ear in silence for exactly 4 seconds and then ended the call. And he placed the phone back on the counter with the same quiet attention to detail that characterized everything he did, and he did not explain himself because there was nothing to explain. I carried James to the nursery. The room was exactly what I had made it, the walls in the pale blue-gray I had applied in 2 careful coats. At 7 months pregnant, the crib assembled over 4 evenings, the mobile turning slowly in the draft from the vent. White stars on a pale field. The music from it was the same quiet loop I had listened to alone in this room many times over the past months. I had built this room without help, and I had gotten James here without help, and both of those things were now simply facts about our lives, without weight attached. I sat down on the floor with my back against the base of the crib, and James across my chest. He was awake, alert in his particular serious way, looking at the mobile above us with the focused attention of someone encountering a rotating object for approximately the 4th time and finding it still worth examining. His weight on my chest was warm and specific and entirely present. I cried for the first time in 5 days. Not from pain. Pain had been the constant of the first days arriving in sequence, alongside each piece of information requiring me to remain upright and functional for each new thing. This was different from that. This was the particular release that comes when a person has been holding the full weight of their own situation at a careful, managed distance so they could keep moving through it and has finally arrived somewhere safe enough to set it down. I cried for a few minutes quietly into the top of James's head, which smelled exactly as it had in the hospital, and which was the most grounding thing in the room. Then I stopped. He did not seem troubled by any of it. Elliot did not leave that evening. He moved from the kitchen to the living room as the afternoon went on, and when dinner was finished and James was down and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, he was on the sofa with the blanket from the hall closet that he had found without being told where it was. I came down at midnight for a glass of water and he was there, and I went back upstairs without saying anything because there was nothing to say. He was there because it was the right thing, and he had already understood that since February. At 10:53, my phone lit up with a number I recognized by the area code. Thinking of you and James tonight. I held the phone for a long time before I set it down. Patricia did not need a reply and probably would not expect one. But I kept the message on the screen for a while, because it was the kind of thing that required being looked at for a moment before you could move on from it. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Somewhere in Manhattan, a hotel room, a quiet office, an apartment with a clean desk and a second monitor. Tatum was going through her slides, running the numbers one more time, rehearsing the language she would use to present an algorithm to a room full of people about to write a check for $50 million. She did not know that I had been inside that codebase for 14 months before she ever touched it. She did not know what I had left there, or what was waiting inside the code she was about to hand to Vanessa Hartwell in exchange for $50 million. She did not know that the wire transfer she was expecting to end this story was about to trigger something else entirely. Elliot had the building's camera feed on his laptop by 1:55. Meridian Capital occupied floors 32 through 35 of a glass commercial tower in Midtown Manhattan, and like most large corporate buildings of its era, its security camera network ran through a centralized building management system that interfaced with external maintenance servers. Building management infrastructure is not treated with the same security discipline as financial systems. Elliot had identified a misconfigured network endpoint on Meridian's public-facing building system in March, during the period when he had been mapping the edges of what the family was doing. And he had noted it quietly and filed it away in the particular way he stored information he could not yet use. He used it now. He had told Diana about it the previous week. She had given him a short, careful answer about what she professionally needed and did not need to know. Then she had moved on to the next item on her list. The conference room was on the 34th floor. We sat at my kitchen table in Westport and watched Tatum Calloway lay her materials out from a camera angle that gave us most of the room, the long table. The shared presentation screen on the far wall, the floor-to-ceiling windows with a midday Manhattan skyline behind them. She had a laptop, 2 printed decks, and the composed certainty of someone who has done this kind of meeting before and has every reason to expect it to go well. She moved through the room, setting up with the brisk efficiency I had watched her bring to everything: charcoal blazer, dark blouse, nothing wasted. She had no reason to be nervous. Vanessa Hartwell arrived at 2:04 with 2 Meridian associates behind her. Preston came in 90 seconds later, quieter than I had expected, taking a seat along the side wall as though his role in the room was to observe rather than lead. He understood whose meeting this was. He understood whose meeting it needed to look like. The room settled. Tatum stood. The presentation began. "She's good," Elliot said. He was not paying her a compliment. He was making a technical observation. She was good. She moved through the material with the fluency of someone who had absorbed it completely. The architecture of the algorithm, the processing capacity, the competitive differentiation, the market application. She ran the live demonstration, and the algorithm did what it always did. It performed exactly as designed, processing a real-time dataset and producing output that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. One of the associates made a note. Preston, along the side wall, permitted himself the smallest possible version of a satisfied expression. I watched my own algorithm perform on a screen in Manhattan and thought for a moment about 14 months. About every decision I had made alone, every revision I had run at 2 in the morning, every deployment test I had completed on an afternoon when Preston was at a meeting he had never described to me in any detail. About the October evening, I had saved the final build and closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of the house for a long time before starting dinner. They were presenting something they did not understand well enough to know what was inside it. At 3:47, Elliot looked at his second screen. "Wire confirmed," he said. His voice was quiet and completely level. 50 million, account received. He looked at me. I looked at the conference room. It took 11 seconds. The shared presentation screen on the far wall of Meridian's conference room went dark. Not a crash, not an error message. Simply dark, the clean, immediate absence of something that had been there a moment before. Tatum reached for her laptop and found her screen the same way. She pressed a key. The machine was awake. The application directory was open. The directory was empty. Every device in that room running the algorithm had received the deletion command the instant the wire transfer confirmed Tatum's laptop, the presentation server, the demo environment that Elliot had anticipated they would use because it matched the standard configuration for this type of pitch. The code had removed every file, every directory, every cached instance of itself from every device simultaneously without writing a single line to any external system, without touching a byte of anything it had not itself installed. It had executed and terminated and left nothing behind. Meridian Capital had just transferred $50 million into an account and received an empty hard drive. Vanessa stood up. She looked at the presentation screen. She looked at Tatum's laptop. She looked at her own device, then at the 2 associates beside her, whose expressions were moving through the same sequence hers had just completed: confusion, investigation, understanding. Then she looked at Preston. He was already looking at his phone, which was ringing with the specific insistence of a call that had been placed by someone who needed to report that the account the wire transfer had landed in was unreachable. The company's primary server was inaccessible, and the algorithm they had just sold to a Manhattan investment fund no longer existed on any device they controlled. He looked up from the screen. His face was not the face of a man who was surprised. It was the face of a man rapidly calculating the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. He was not wrong to start calculating. At 3:52, 5 minutes after the wire confirmed, while the Meridian conference room was still in its first stage of controlled crisis, Diana Walsh filed simultaneously with two federal bodies. The Securities and Exchange Commission received a complaint alleging investment fraud material, misrepresentation of intellectual property ownership, and fraudulent inducement of a securities transaction. The FBI field office in New Haven received the criminal complaint she had been building since Saturday, expanded now to include wire fraud in connection with a $50 million transaction. She had been ready since Saturday. She had been waiting for the wire. I closed the laptop screen. The kitchen was quiet. James was asleep in the infant seat beside the table, the same way he had been for the past 2 hours, undisturbed by what had just happened in a conference room 34 floors above Midtown Manhattan, which seemed like the correct response. Elliot sat back in his chair and said nothing. I picked James up and held him against my chest, and said nothing either, because the moment did not require words, and neither of us had any to add. At 9:11 the following morning, I heard 2 cars pull into my driveway. Elliot looked up from the sofa. I already had my phone in my hand and the security camera app open. The front drive feed was clear. They were all there. Preston in the first car, Gerald beside him, Constance in the back seat. Tatum's car was behind them. She had driven 3 hours from Manhattan, apparently. At some point the previous evening, after the conference room had finally emptied. And standing just behind Preston, having stepped out of the passenger side of his car with the measured composure of someone who has spent the night reconsidering every decision that led her to this driveway, was Vanessa Hartwell. Her expression was not the expression of someone who had come to support the people she arrived with. That expression told me everything I needed to know about why she was actually there. I had not rehearsed any of it. There are conversations that write themselves the moment you understand precisely what they are not, through preparation, but through clarity. I had understood what this conversation was going to be since the morning Elliot turned the laptop toward me in that hospital room. I simply had not needed to practice. I checked the security camera app one more time before I opened the door. They were at the foot of the porch steps. Preston in front, wearing the composed bearing of a man who had spent the night with attorneys. Gerald slightly behind him, the leather portfolio under his arm, the same one he had carried to my kitchen table in October. Constance to his left, expression blank in the way of someone who has decided blankness is a form of defense. Tatum at the edge, hands in her coat pockets, calculating. And Vanessa Hartwell, standing fractionally apart from the others in the way people stand apart when their interests have recently separated. Diana was at my left shoulder. Elliot was at my right with the laptop open. Dorothy had arrived at 7:30, already inside before any of them reached the driveway. James was on my chest, one hand behind his head asleep. I opened the door. Preston looked at my face, then at the infant against my chest. He had not been to the hospital. He had not seen James since I had driven away at 2:14 in the morning. He said, in the tone of a man who has chosen confusion as a strategy, "Where's the baby?" I looked at him for a moment. "Which baby, Preston?" The porch went completely still. Gerald stepped forward with the boardroom authority that had worked for 30 years. "We need to address the company's situation. There are financial consequences requiring—" Gerald. Diana's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "Save that for your attorney. Whatever he charges, I promise it won't be sufficient." Vanessa stepped away from the group. She lowered her voice. "Nora, this can be resolved. Restore access to the system, provide the reactivation key, and Meridian withdraws. Clean separation for everyone." She expected me to find it reasonable. What she had done in those 3 sentences was describe her knowledge that the system existed, that it had been taken, and that she had come specifically to recover it, while 2 Westport police officers Diana had stationed at the base of my driveway since 8:45 recorded every word. Vanessa had no idea they were there. She had handed them a clean, voluntary admission. I looked at Preston. "You've been sterile since the motorcycle accident in March of 2019. I said. My voice was even. "You knew. Gerald's physician told you that spring. And then the same physician told me, at a prenatal appointment I attended alone, that you had no fertility concerns of any kind. 2 reports, 1 doctor, 1 decision about what each of us needed to believe." Preston did not move. "James is my son. Biologically mine through IVF, with an anonymous donor whose identity you will never have access to, because I made that decision alone, the way I made every decision in that house. But you accepted him, didn't you? You looked at a pregnancy you knew could not have come from you, and for 9 months, you said nothing. Because what James was worth to the inheritance clause was more valuable to you than the truth. You needed an heir. I provided one. And you stayed silent. And let me believe we were building something together, and then you reached for your AirPods. Preston said nothing. He had never run out of words before. He had nothing now. Gerald. Dorothy Calloway walked through the doorway past me, past Elliot holding a document in both hands. Back straight. Eyes the same sharp, clear blue I had first seen in the hospital. Gerald looked at his mother. He had not seen her stand like this. Not since before the dinners where she forgot the year, the afternoons where he had managed her estate in front of her, and she had said nothing to challenge him. He looked at her now, and saw a woman who had been watching him for 2 years with perfect clarity, holding a document sealed in a New Haven safe deposit box since the day she signed it. She looked back without any expression he could use. Dorothy placed the original will in Diana's hands without breaking eye contact with her son. I watched Gerald Calloway's face do something I had never seen it do before. The authority left first. Then the certainty. Then something beneath both the structural layer that had held everything else in place. Every piece of it came apart. Elliot looked at me from the other side of the door. I nodded once. He pressed enter. The gate at the end of the driveway swung closed. The outdoor floodlights came on simultaneously, unnecessary in the morning light, deliberate in what they communicated. And then the exterior speaker system activated. Gerald's voice came through the outdoor speakers at a volume that carried clearly across the driveway and down Greens Farms Road. If she miscarries, all the better. His own words. The recording from Dorothy's living room on December 18th captured on a security camera in a room where a posted sign had been visible for 2 years. His voice played with the flat, practical tone he had used when he said it, the tone of a man discussing a logistical preference, and then it looped. And the neighborhood heard it twice before the first police car turned into the drive. Gerald raised his hand. The instinct of a man who has always stopped things by asserting himself into the space between a problem and its consequence. He looked at Elliot, who looked back with the calm of someone who had thought this through considerably further ahead. There was nothing Gerald could do. Every system on the property was running from Elliot's machine. 2 Westport Police Department vehicles stopped at the gate. Diana had coordinated the timing, and the warrants issued by a Connecticut Superior Court judge over the preceding 4 days had been in the officer's possession since that morning. Gerald first. Conspiracy to commit assault, insurance fraud, coercion. He said nothing when they read the charges. He looked at the officers with the expression of a man finding the math not in his favor. Constance next. Conspiracy, the misoprostol, the car sensor, the kitchen doorstep at 2 in the morning. She walked with the rigid posture of a woman holding the last asset available to her. Tatum, IP theft, conspiracy to commit IP fraud, participation in a fraudulent investment transaction. She went quietly, already thinking about her next move. She had always been practical. Vanessa, investment fraud, wire fraud. Her own admission recorded by 2 officers at the base of my driveway since 8:45. She had walked into the most consequential conversation of her career without knowing it was being documented. She walked to the second police car with the composure of someone who has accepted what is happening and is already focused on what comes after. Preston was last. He came down the steps between 2 officers, conspiracy, financial fraud, wire fraud, and 9 months of silence about a medical fact that had restructured everything. At the bottom of the steps, he stopped for half a second. He looked at James, at his face. At the uncomplicated way a 7-day-old person occupies space on someone's chest without knowing anything about what is happening around them. Then the officer moved and Preston moved with him, and he did not look back. Diana filed the emergency asset freeze with the probate court at 9:41. Every account, every property, every financial instrument connected to the Calloway Family Holdings Group was frozen before noon. I stood at the threshold and watched. Dorothy was in the hallway behind me, standing very still. Elliot was beside me with the laptop closed. James was on my chest asleep through all of it, which was the correct response, and which I would tell him about someday. The driveway was empty. The gate was closed. I thought about Post Road at 2:14 in the morning, the only car at a red light. Counting out loud to stay present. I had driven alone on an empty road trying to survive the night. And I had made it. And everything that came after had come from that single decision to keep driving when the easier thing would have been to stay in that kitchen and wait for someone to choose me. I had made a different call, and this time the people who showed up were exactly the ones I needed. I reached for the door handle. I closed it not with force, not with the satisfaction that slamming it might have offered, because this was not that kind of ending. I closed it the way I had closed the bedroom door on the night of April 11th, when I had stood in the dark hallway and understood that somebody was going to have to figure out how to get to the hospital, and that somebody was me. Gently, completely, with the quiet finality of a thing that is done. I don't tell this story because it ended well. I tell it because for too long it almost didn't. Family betrayal doesn't always arrive wearing a mask. Sometimes it sits across from you at the dinner table. Sometimes it signs its name next to yours. When the warning signs were there, I kept finding more comfortable explanations. Don't be like me. When the evidence is in front of you, read it. When the door opens, walk through it. You don't have to be ready. I drove to that hospital alone in labor, counting out loud to stay conscious. I was not ready. I did it anyway. I believe God placed James in my arms that morning as a reminder: survival is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of the one you actually choose. Family revenge was never what I wanted. I wanted the truth on record. I wanted my son to know his mother did not stay silent. Family betrayal costs everything, but family revenge costs nothing when the evidence does the work for you. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Share it. Subscribe if you haven't. I'll be here. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for education and reflection. If this isn't for you, no judgment. Choose what's right for you.
We've come to the final point. Thanks for staying with me. I'll catch you next time.